Some more of these international headlines. Remember, we were previewing for you some of the talks that are about to be underway, especially with regard to the Russia-Ukraine war. In Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, of all places, Secretary of State Marco Rubio on the ground in the kingdom, as well as Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who's not on the ground. Well, any Ukrainian. And so we'll be talking about why that is. Remember, Zelensky has already said any talks without Ukraine on an end of the war are going to be a non-starter here. But let's talk about some of these really stunning updates as we approach the 3-year mark since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of its neighbor there. Fox's Doug Luzader has more on that from Washington.
President Trump has long talked about ending the war in Ukraine. We're about to get into the thorny details now, but Ukraine is fighting any effort to sideline them in this process. President Trump in the presidential limousine leading the pack for the start of the Daytona 500 yesterday. But a victory lap for ending the war in Ukraine seems a long way off, even with talks set to begin this week. Trump said Russian President Vladimir Putin is looking for a way out.
I think he wants to end it, and they want to end it fast. Both of them. And Zelensky wants to end it too.
But how much ground is Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky willing to concede? Overnight, Secretary of State Marco Rubio arrived in Saudi Arabia to begin talks with Russian officials. But Ukraine is not included, at least not yet. Zelensky says he needs to play a part.
I will never accept any decisions between the United States and Russia about Ukraine. Never.
Trump says Zelensky will be included in the process, and it's clear that both sides may have to give.
One thing is clear. No one is going to walk out of this with everything that they want. It's not going to be the perfect deal for the Ukrainians. It's not going to be the perfect deal for the Russians. It's not going to be every single thing that the Americans would want in this.
And one of the next steps could be a face-to-face meeting between Putin and Trump.
It could be very soon.
Like this month?
Well,
or?
It'll be soon. We'll see what happens.
Trump had a telephone call with Putin last week. He also spoke separately with Zelensky, trying to lay the groundwork for a deal. In Washington, Doug Luzader, Fox News.
Doug, thanks so much. In the meantime here, we do want to talk about this even deeper, as we always do, with national security analyst and expert and retired Marine intelligence officer Hal Kempfer. He joins me. Hal, good to see you here. I hope you had a good weekend. I know you were on LiveNOW over the weekend helping us make sense of some of these really just incredible statements and scenes coming out of the Munich Security Conference. Let's move from Munich, though, to Paris. I want to put this up here. Ursula von der Leyen with this photo. She's, of course, the president of the European Commission, saying, "Today in Paris, we reaffirmed that Ukraine deserves peace through strength. Peace respectful of its independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, with strong security guarantees. Europe carries its full share of the military assistance to Ukraine." Also, the UK Prime Minister Starmer, also with this message today in Paris. Let's watch.
I'm here in Paris about to meet other European leaders to talk about defence and security in Ukraine. If there is a peace deal, and everybody wants a peace deal, then it's got to be a lasting peace deal, not just a pause for Putin to come again. So that needs to be discussed. There's also a wider piece here, which is the collective security and defence in Europe. And here, I think we've got a generational challenge. We've all got to step up in terms of capability and what we do as Europeans. And that's certainly the case, the message, the argument that I'll be making.
Okay, so Hal, this is an emergency meeting. I mean, that's what it's being reported as there in Paris, in the wake, on the heels of the Munich Security Conference. Why is this happening right now? And I'm going to ask you this. In the wake of Munich, was Europe thrown under the bus by members of the Trump administration, by Vice President J.D. Vance in his speech that is still frankly, roiling and reverberating in some of these European capitals here? Was Europe thrown under the bus in Munich?
I don't know if they were thrown under the bus, Andrew, but there was a feeling among some of the European nations that they just simply weren't being appreciated by the United States. It was interesting. Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, who's very senior Trump administration foreign policy military advisor, was in Munich was had to explain. He says, "America first doesn't mean America only," and that was kind of assuaging some of the feelings that came out of not just Vice President Vance's comments, but particularly out of in terms of military policy, out of Secretary of Defense Hegseth's comments the day before. And so some of that was, I think, a little bit of damage control, if you will, on a diplomatic level.
Okay.
Probably. I mean, they were pretty strong. And I have to say, the one that kind of roils them has less to do with the military dynamics, the European security dynamics, as far as Vice President Vance. I think they were particularly roiled with his comments about their internal domestic political situations regarding hate speech and things like that. I think that really, really set a tone amongst the European leaders, European capitals, that the U.S. was lecturing them on things, which kind of was a reversal of our longstanding policy that politics stops at the water's edge.
Right.
Well, this went over the water, and it's clearly right in the middle of Europe, and it was in front of all their faces. So that was a big shift, big change, and so there's a lot of frustration on many different levels.
So, and you always kind of bring this down to earth, these conversations. On the part of some of the critics of the Trump administration's foray into the Russia-Ukraine war and the strategy and the approach about how to end it, especially with regard to some of our European allies who are critical of that approach right now, we can get to that. Is there a level of hysteria with the criticism, or are they right to be concerned not only about what happens to Ukraine, but what happens to Europe writ large? And I wanted to ask you, are these members of the Trump administration in these foreign policy roles, Rubio and Vance and Kellogg and Witkoff and Trump, are they all on the same page? Because the messages that we have gotten out of Munich and with Hegseth's NATO trip last week, no U.S. troops will ever be in Ukraine for any reason. But then J.D. Vance over the weekend was essentially threatening that very premise against Putin if Putin did not somewhat accede or concede to the demands made by the U.S. in some hypothetical scenario with regard to the Russia-Ukraine settlement talks. So you have that going on. You also have Trump also saying, no, Ukraine will be part of the talks, but they're not part of the talks in Riyadh. Are they all on the same page? Help us make sense of it.
I have to say, and I've said this before on the air, which is there's a little bit of coordination and strategic communications that needs to take place. There's been walking back. Secretary Hegseth walked back his comments, walked back a lot of his comments on Thursday from what he said on Wednesday. Vice President Vance has had to kind of clarify some things. And it even goes beyond that. I mean, certainly what I just mentioned with General Kellogg's, his comments clarifying it. Secretary Rubio seems to be really, and he's our lead diplomat as Secretary of State, but he seems to be kind of reinterpreting, but he seems to be putting oil on troubled waters or whatever with these comments. And he's actually, I have to commend him. Some of the things he said has really kind of helped smooth things out, some of the rougher edges, if you will, of some of the comments made. But one thing I would point out, that the issue you brought up of troops on, boots on the ground, troops in Ukraine as part of any peacekeeping agreement. Reports are coming out. There was this President Trump had talked about getting access to rare earths in Ukraine, and they sent over a high-level delegation. They sat down and basically gave Ukraine a draft proposal to look at. President Zelensky said, "I'm going to take a look at it." There was various reports. One of the reports was that it was asking for pretty much about half of the rare earths in return for nothing.
Right.
A more recent report, though, is there was something in there. It's like it's still stuck around half of the rare earths value, and there have been some comments that President Trump has said, $500 billion and trying to, get reimbursed for all the money that we have sent over to Ukraine. I'm not quite sure if that was correctly interpreted.
Okay.
There are some folks running around with that. But one thing that is interesting in that draft document, and it sounds very credible, was discussion of in exchange for U.S. security presence in Ukraine.
Okay.
In other words, basically talking about U.S. boots on the ground. Now, compare that to all the other comments you've heard this last week.
Sure.
And keep in mind, this is all happening in the same week. It leaves me kind of scratching my head, and I kind of go back to my opening statement, which is there needs to be better coordination from a strategic communication standpoint, because you have different parts of the administration saying slightly different things, and in some cases saying significantly different things.
Yeah, and the saying slightly different things, I mean, that matters just as much as saying largely different things in negotiations that are this sensitive. I think you would agree with that assessment. I put this tweet up here because it looks like Starmer is going to go to D.C. next week to meet with Trump, and this is going to be their first in-person meeting, I believe, since the election here stateside. And to your point, we were talking about whether or not all of this is a negotiating tactic last week. Starmer coming out and saying, say whatever happens with Ukraine and Russia in order to keep the peace, to keep the line of contact. He was floating the idea of possibly having British troops keep the peace as part of this international peacekeeping force, if you will. And obviously we're speaking in hypothetical scenarios here because we're not even there yet. But maybe that is a response to some of the hard-dealing, freewheeling negotiations and statements being made by the U.S. Also, Donald Tusk, the Polish prime minister, saying this: if we Europeans fail to spend big on defense now, we will be forced to spend 10 times more if we don't prevent a wider war. He says, as the Polish PM, I'm entitled to say it loud and clear, since Poland already spends almost 5% of its GDP on defense, and we will continue to do so. That seems to be somewhat of a rallying cry to his fellow NATO members. Hey, bump it up to 5% like the Poles do.
Absolutely. In fact, the Poles are pretty much, they have been the most aggressive in saying, look, we got to spend on defense. There's a lot of reasons why the Poles have to spend on defense, because there's a Suwalki Gap, which is that gap between there's this Kaliningrad, this area that Russia controls. It's still part of Russia, that is physically cut off from the rest of Russia. And there's only so many ways to get in there. And one of the ways is you go up this little gap that puts you in direct confrontation with Poland amongst some other NATO members. So they're right there. They're right on the edge. So they've been very aggressive. You know, if you look at the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, they have also been leaning forward. One of the newest NATO members, Finland, has always been leaning forward. They've been very aggressive in this. Some of the other members, to include even in Eastern Europe, are well below that the goal, or I shouldn't say the goal, but the level that we see with Poland and some of the others. So they've got to really kind of bring it up. I'm not going to name them, although I will name some ones that are further away. Spain and Portugal have always been way underinvesting. And interestingly, traditionally, although they're over 2% now, they're about 2.4%. Great Britain, within Great Britain, there's been a lot of discussion about how bad, and I've been doing a lot of things over the years. We've talked about how underinvested the British are in their own military. They've been shrinking. His comments by Starmer are rather interesting, because just last week, one of the former chiefs of the British Armed Forces says, we don't have enough troops to do peacekeeping over in Ukraine. We're that far behind. He goes, I don't even know what we're talking about at this point. Now, with all that said, I would like to point out there is a model for what can be done. It's not at the scale that needs to be done in Ukraine, but if you look at what NATO has been doing in the Baltic states, where they have various different regiments, brigades, if you will, that go into Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and they work side by side with their host nation counterparts doing defensive operations. I hate to use the term, but it's often called a tripwire force. You know, they're there. They are substantial. They are significant, but they're not going to stop the whole Russian army from rushing in. But it's enough to get committed. That is an example of what could be done. With that said, there's not enough forces. Now, if I could leave you with one thought, you may have recall that President Trump met with Prime Minister Modi of India last week. All right. India has very large forces. They have an extremely large army. That would be a bit of a wild card, but this is not a NATO operation.
Okay.
And there is a possibility that they could be looking at other countries to provide that force And one of those other countries might be India. And India might want to do that for a variety of different reasons.
I see.
Not the least of which is they're trying to kind of put some distance between them and Russia and trying to move closer to the West. So there are a variety of possibilities of what that peacekeeping force could look like.
So just briefly and lastly, Hal, we heard from Hegseth over the weekend as well. And he was essentially, and I'm paraphrasing here, talking about European security guarantees from the United States. And he essentially said, well, it can't last forever. And what you're seeing in Paris today among some of these European allies led by the European Commission, was the United States right in saying the Europeans, Europe writ large, they need to get tougher. They need to think more about their security, about beefing up their military expenditures, because the United States isn't always going to be there. Did they need to hear that?
Well, they kind of did. And, you know, a lot of the questions over the years is what will it take to get the Europeans serious about really investing in their own defense? It's been a problem. It's been a problem certainly since the end of the Cold War. There's been this rapid divestment of various different countries saying, well, there's no big threat now. The Soviet Union's gone, you know. And when they look at China, look, China's a long way away from Germany, all right? It's a long way away from France. It's not as far away from the United States. We have not just our presence in the Pacific, we have possessions in the Pacific which are very close to China, and we have commitments. And so we have this global requirement that they don't have. We've been trying to cajole them, trying to get them to invest more. You know, certainly the first Trump administration, they're the ones that said you need to get up to 2% of your GDP. Sure. Now we're saying 5%. What would it take to convince them that they have to take the reins of their own defense future? And if you look at it that way, and you look at how Donald Trump traditionally kind of does negotiation and business and other things, I'm kind of wondering if part of this isn't his negotiation techniques, which is throw this stuff out there. Yeah. You know, we would say, you know, it's obviously causing a bit of a storm, but throw this stuff out there and get the Europeans serious talking about stepping up and doing their own defense needs. And if he looks at what's happening on Monday, he's probably saying, that's kind of what I was hoping to see happen. So I'm just pointing that out. It's a possibility, but in all great negotiations, you never show your hand. Sure. He's never going to admit that publicly. Even if they have success, he'll never admit that publicly. It's just the way those things are kind of done. So there might be a lot of this negotiating in public, shall we say.
Okay. Hal Kempfer, as always, it's just Monday, Hal. We'll be speaking a lot this week. We'll talk soon.